Andy Cohen has spent 18 years perfecting one specific skill, finding the exact question that sounds like banter until it isn't. He had never once tried it on a man who'd already survived a 6-week trial with his entire life dissected on a witness stand. That changed the night Johnny Depp walked in, loose and funny, writing the strangest comeback arc in modern Hollywood. Andy smelled opportunity within the first 5 minutes. A guest with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Exactly the kind of combination that cracks. What Andy didn't account for was that Johnny Depp had spent 3 years learning precisely how it feels to have a single sentence turned into a 6-month news cycle, and had gotten very, very good at making sure that never happened to him again, no matter how good the cocktail or how warm the lighting got. By the time the segment ended, a man who has never once lost control of his own bar in 18 years on air would find himself sitting behind it in dead silence. Nobody in that room could have predicted exactly which question would be the one that did it. Subscribe right now, because you're about to watch the one guest Andy Cohen never should have tried to crack live on television. The Clubhouse glowed its usual candy-colored pink and orange that night, the bartender already mixing something called the second act, Andy's own invention, named specifically for the occasion. The Bravo wall of headshots grinned down from behind the bar, and the studio audience buzzed with the particular electricity reserved for a guest almost nobody expected to see on this couch. Johnny Depp walked in, that familiar half-smile already working before he'd said a word. The applause ran long enough that Andy had to wait before speaking. "Johnny Depp, everybody," Andy said, grinning as his guest settled onto the bar stool. "I genuinely did not think I'd get you in this clubhouse." "Neither did I, honestly," Johnny said, his voice carrying that familiar rasp. "But Ebenezer's coming out for the holidays, day drinkers locked for next spring, and somebody told me you pour a stronger drink than my publicist recommends." The audience roared. Andy laughed, delighted, already sensing this was shaping into good television. The first several minutes moved exactly the way a WWHL segment should. Playing Scrooge for Ty West, the strange joy of doing a proper ghost story after years of avoiding anything that might read as autobiographical. Reuniting with Penelope Cruz for a 4th film since Blow, the two of them now old enough in their friendship to finish each other's jokes on set. Andy asked about learning to sit still on camera without hiding behind a costume, and Johnny answered with more thought than the moment technically required. "Turns out being still is harder than any accent I've ever done," he said. "No wig to disappear into, just me." Then Andy reached for a collar, and something in his expression shifted, sharper, hungrier. The audience didn't notice yet. The bartender did. "Before we get to that," Andy said, gesturing at Johnny's still full cocktail glass, "you haven't touched your drink all night. Everything okay? I know there was a lot made of your relationship with alcohol during everything. Wanted to check in, human to human." The question landed with an odd weight, dressed up as concern but carrying something sharper underneath. "I'm good, Andy," Johnny said, his tone still light, though his eyes had sharpened slightly. "I just don't always drink on camera anymore. Seems smarter, historically speaking." "Fair," Andy said, grinning, though he didn't quite let it go. "Just wanted to check in." "Appreciate the concern," Johnny said, the faintest edge entering his voice. "Though I notice it arrived right as the cameras panned toward my glass instead of my face." The audience laughed nervously, unsure if that was meant as a joke. The caller was harmless enough, a fan from Ohio gushing about Pirates of the Caribbean. Johnny answered warmly, telling a story about Captain Jack's walk that had the whole clubhouse laughing. Then Andy set the phone down and reached for a card he clearly hadn't needed for the earlier questions. "All right, we gotta do plead the 5th, he said, grinning. 3 questions. You gotta answer at least 2, Johnny." "Oh boy," Johnny said, laughing but shifting slightly on the bar stool. "Here we go." The first question was easy: Cage or Cruise for a hypothetical action franchise. Johnny answered without hesitation, keeping the mood light. The second question landed heavier. Word on the street is you still keep a private list of every journalist who covered the trial unfavorably. True or false? The clubhouse went quiet in that particular Bravo-adjacent way. The silence right before a housewife's face changes on camera. Johnny's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes went very still. False, he said evenly. And I'd love to know who's spreading that one, Andy. I plead the fifth on my source, Andy said, grinning, clearly delighted the tension was building. But since we're here, Day Drinkers, your first big studio picture back. A lot of industry people are calling it a comeback. Does it bother you that some people will always attach an asterisk to whatever you do next, no matter how good the movie is? The audience made a small, uncertain sound, somewhere between excitement and discomfort. Everybody's entitled to their asterisk, Johnny said, his voice calm but with something firming up underneath it. I can't control what strangers decide to believe about 6 years of my life based on headlines they read before any evidence existed. I can only control the work. Day Drinkers' good work. That's all I've got the energy to control at this point. Sure, but public perception doesn't always follow good work, Andy pressed, leaning in with that familiar reality TV instinct for finding the crack. There are still people who will never separate the actor from the trial. Doesn't that eat at you a little? Walking back into a big franchise picture knowing that? It used to eat at me a lot more than it does now, Johnny said. I've made my peace with the fact that some people decided the ending of my story before I got to write the middle of it. Some industry insiders have suggested the whole comeback narrative is being carefully managed by a PR team, frame by frame, Andy added, glancing toward the audience for effect. Christmas movie for the family crowd, action thriller with an old friend, everything timed just right for maximum sympathy. Is that fair? Or is that just how Hollywood redemption arcs actually work? Johnny's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went very still. You think Mark Webb cast me in Ebenezer because a publicist called him with a redemption strategy? He asked, his voice quiet but pointed. Ty West wrote that role because he thought I understood grief and ghosts better than most actors his age could. Penelope's been asking to work with me again since Murder on the Orient Express. None of that is strategy, Andy. That's just people who know me deciding they still wanted to make something together. Andy, sensing the shift but unable to resist pushing further, gestured toward the big screen behind the bar. Actually, speaking of the middle of the story, we pulled a clip. The screen lit up with a blurry paparazzi photo montage set to dramatic music, ending on a shaky video of Johnny outside a courthouse, visibly exhausted, his expression tight and drawn. That's a rough stretch right there, Andy said, watching Johnny's face for a reaction. Take us back. What was actually going through your head in that moment? Johnny watched the screen in silence, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. And when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. That was the day I found out my own testimony had already been edited into a highlight reel for cable news before I'd even left the courthouse, he said quietly. I'd been awake 2 days straight preparing to defend 6 years of my life to strangers who'd mostly already decided the verdict. You want to play that for a laugh, Andy? I wasn't going for a laugh. Then what were you going for? Johnny asked, and the clubhouse went dead silent. Because from where I'm sitting, that looked a lot like finding the worst week of somebody's life and turning it into a segment transition. What exactly did you think that clip was going to prove? That I looked exhausted during the hardest month of my life? Congratulations, you found footage of a human being under unbearable pressure. I could have told you that for free. The bartender had stopped mid-pour, the bottle still tilted in his hand. I guess I just thought it'd be a compelling visual to revisit, Andy tried. Compelling for who? Johnny's voice remained quiet, but had gained an edge. Not for me. I lived it once already. I don't need to relive it for a transition into plead the fifth. Andy tried to recover, his usual charm faltering slightly. Okay, fair. Let's lighten it back up then. Real quick. Anybody in Hollywood who dropped you during all that you'd love to finally call out, live, on the record? Safe space. Nobody leaves the clubhouse without dishing a little dirt. The clubhouse practically vibrated with anticipation. This was the exact moment WWHL was built for. The dish, the tea, the name nobody expected to hear. No, Johnny said simply. Come on, seriously, Andy pressed, sensing a viral moment slipping away. Not one name? Not one so-called friend who ghosted the second the headlines hit? There were plenty, Johnny said. I'm just not naming them for a segment. I watched single sentences turn into 6-month news cycles for 3 straight years. I'm not handing you raw material to do that to somebody else, no matter how good the ratings would be. Why not, though? You'd be a hero to half the internet by morning, Andy pushed, leaning forward. And the other half would build a new narrative out of it by lunch, Johnny said. I know exactly how fast a single sentence spins out of control once it's out there. I'm not interested in doing that to anyone else, no matter how satisfying it might feel for about 6 hours. That's a very noble answer for someone who's been pretty vocal in the past about who wronged him, Andy said, an edge creeping into his voice now. I've been vocal about facts, in a courtroom, with evidence, Johnny replied. There's a difference between accountability and gossip, Andy. This whole network's built on blurring that line for entertainment. I'm not going to help blur it further just because it'd make good television tonight. My show isn't the same as what happened to you, Andy said, his composure visibly thinning. Isn't it, though? Johnny tilted his head slightly. You take people who are already vulnerable, sometimes already drunk, and you find the exact angle that gets the reaction you need for a clip. I watched that happen to me for years by people with fancier titles than yours. Tonight you're just doing it with a Bravo lanyard on instead of a press badge. That's a pretty harsh read of 18 years of television, Andy said, an edge of genuine hurt slipping into his voice. Maybe it is, Johnny allowed. But I've spent 3 years learning to recognize the exact shape of this conversation from every possible angle. Doesn't matter if it's a courtroom sketch artist or a cocktail named after me. The shape's the same. Somebody wants the moment where I stop being careful. The temperature in the clubhouse had dropped noticeably. Andy's grin was still there, but it had gone tight at the edges. I think you're being a little dramatic about a fun segment. Was the clip fun? Johnny asked. Was showing my worst week on a screen for a reaction shot fun? Because this whole night's had a pretty consistent theme, Andy. Dig for the wound. Check if it's still fresh. Play it back if it is. That's not what Plead the Fifth is about. Then, what was the journalist question about? What was the clip about? Johnny's voice remained level, but something underneath it had sharpened considerably. You've spent this whole segment hunting for the one thread that unravels me on camera, same as everybody did 3 years ago. I'd have thought a guy who's built an empire on manufactured reality television would understand better than most how it feels to have your worst moment turned into somebody else's ratings. Andy's composure cracked slightly. That's an unfair comparison. Is it? Johnny leaned forward, his voice quiet but carrying real weight now. You've spent 18 years getting people drunk enough and cornered enough on this exact couch to say something they'll regret by morning. That's not an insult, Andy. That's literally the premise of your show. Tonight you just happened to pick somebody who already lived through the worst version of that and came out refusing to do it again. The clubhouse had gone completely silent. Even the shot ski propped in the corner seemed to be holding its breath. I came here tonight to talk about a Christmas movie and a thriller I'm proud of, Johnny continued. I answered your questions. I played your games. The moment I wouldn't hand you a scandal, you pulled up the worst week of my life on a screen like it was a highlight reel instead of somebody's actual trauma. Johnny, I think we're just having a candid conversation. No, Johnny said, setting his untouched cocktail down on the bar with quiet finality. A candid conversation doesn't need a gotcha clip and a fishing expedition for gossip. What just happened here was a pitch for content, dressed up as banter, and I'm not interested in being the ingredients. He stood up slowly, the movement pulling the air out of the room. You built this whole clubhouse on the idea that everybody eventually cracks if you pour enough drinks and ask the right, wrong question. I get it. It's worked for 18 years. But some of us have already cracked once, in front of the entire world, on a much bigger stage than this one, and we don't have anything left to prove to a man hoping for a viral clip. He looked around at the frozen audience, at the bartender who'd stopped moving entirely, at Andy's tightened jaw. I'm not angry at you exactly. I think you've just been doing this so long, in a genre built entirely on manufactured drama, that you forgot some of your guests are people who already survived a version of this that wasn't manufactured at all. It was just real. And it nearly cost me everything I'd spent 30 years building. He paused, letting that settle over the room. You asked me earlier if the asterisk bothers me. Here's my honest answer, since apparently we're doing honest tonight. It bothers me less than watching somebody try to manufacture a new one live on television, in real time, because the old one wasn't quite fresh enough for this week's episode. That's not fair, I was just... Andy started, but Johnny wasn't finished. I know exactly what you were doing, Johnny said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder. You wanted the moment where I finally said something ugly enough to trend by morning. I've had 3 years of practice not giving people that moment anymore. Tonight was no different. He picked his sunglasses up off the bar. For what it's worth, Andy, I actually like this show. I like the chaos, the ridiculous cocktails, all of it. But somewhere in 18 years, you forgot that the people sitting on this couch are actual human beings, not content waiting to happen. I hope you remember that before the next person who's already been through hell sits down across from you. He set the untouched second act cocktail down gently on the bar, right in front of Andy, as if returning something that had never really belonged to him. Enjoy the rest of the show, he said quietly. I hope your next guest gets an easier night than this one turned out to be. And with that, Johnny Depp, a man rebuilding a career one honest film at a time, already having survived the most public reckoning of the decade, set his glass down, nodded once to the stunned audience, and walked off the Watch What Happens Live set, the first guest in the show's 18-year history to leave before the credits rolled. The silence that followed was absolute. Andy Cohen sat frozen behind the bar, his own cocktail untouched, his usual easy grin nowhere to be found. The audience didn't applaud. Nobody seemed to know if they were allowed to. Nearly a full minute passed before a producer's voice finally crackled through his earpiece. Andy didn't answer it. He just stared at the empty bar stool where, moments earlier, a man who had already survived the worst version of public judgment had proven, without raising his voice once, that some people simply can't be baited into becoming someone else's viral moment twice. The bartender quietly set down the shot ski nobody would be using tonight. The cameras kept rolling on the empty seat, the untouched cocktail, and a host who, for the first time in 18 years on that couch, had absolutely nothing left to say.